what the hell is going on? What's really going on? We said, what the hell happened? You don't have to know what the hell is on it. They see what's going on. I don't know what's going on. What is going on? We must find out what is going on.
Hi, I'm Danielle Pletka.
I'm Mark Thiessen.
Welcome to our podcast. What the hell is going on? Mark, what the hell?
Well, the coronavirus impact...
We can't talk about anything else.
The impact is finally hitting home because AEI is shutting down.
We're not shutting down work. We're just shutting down the office.
The office. We're all going to be working from home, social
You aren't
distancing.
seeing the air quotes there.
Social distancing. So, Daddy, keep your distance.
Don't worry, I already do.
Not sharing a microphone.
Right. No Trump cooties for me.
Exactly. We're going to find a way to continue podcasting, but if you have a temporary interruption in your podcast service from us, understand it's because we're trying to find a studio to record this.
You can go back and listen to the ones you missed, which are excellent. But today...
If you say so yourself.
If I do say so myself. Right. Don't forget to subscribe, review, and all of that stuff, too. So today we're talking about the economic impact of the coronavirus. Is it going to shut down our economy? Is it going to end trade with China? What's going to happen? There's a lot out there.
Yeah, so, I mean, this is a huge issue. So we are finding right now, first of all, not just AEI, but schools, universities, businesses are shutting down.
The Masters, the NBA, the NCAA, everything.
National Hockey League. But more broadly, we're finding how economically dependent we really are on China, which is concerning. So there's like statistics about that we get huge amounts of our medicines and biologics from China, generic drugs from China. We are incredibly economically intertwined with China, which is a totalitarian dictatorship. If you've been listening to our podcast, we just did a great episode on the link between totalitarianism and the public health threat from China. Lies about the virus, lies about the problems it's facing, lies to itself about the challenges it's facing, and then lies to the world. And we really need to just have a national discussion of, should we be this economically dependent and economically intertwined, or should we start looking at ways of decoupling from China?
So that's really been, I think, where the discussion about China has been headed for the last couple of years. And, it's gotten muddled because the president is totally focused on trade balances rather than on sectors and threats. And that's a problem for us. There's a problem in that we don't have a consensus with a lot of our allies about the nature of the challenge from China. But I think one of the things that we've tried to tease out in all the discussions that we've had about this challenge is that the trading relationship we have with China is leverage for the Chinese. Okay? They use every sector of their economy to squeeze us. And so even from the most basic viewpoint, we ought to be diversified. The notion that we get 80% of our heparin or our antibiotics from communist China is just dumb. If you were living in your neighborhood and at the end of your block there was a drugstore being run by the mafia, you would not buy your things from that drugstore to the exclusion of all others, right? You would make sure that there was a couple of other places that you knew had it just in case. And yet the United States is still buying from the mafia communist drugstore in Beijing.
That's a great analogy. But look, there's also an issue that, I think something like 80% or 90% of the products that are sold, from clothes to sneakers, that are the things that cost under $100, that are shoes and sneakers and clothes, come from China.
But
toilet paper. No, but that's my point. Do we care if our sneakers come from China? No. Do we care if our toilet paper comes from China? Well, we're having a run on toilet paper, so maybe we do. But I mean, maybe that's a national security issue. But no, we don't. Laundry detergent, no. Our drugs are life-saving biologics, and I'm sure there are other, our cell phones and our communications infrastructure with Huawei. We have to have a national conversation about how dependent we want to be on China.
And especially in key sectors.
If you want to have cheap T-shirts going to Walmart, all saying "Made in China," go for it. I don't care. But when we get a situation where we're going to have a run on the pharmacies because we can't get the basic ingredients to make ADHD medications, antidepressants,
antivirals for HIV.
Antivirals for HIV. Okay, if we're dependent on them and we can't get those things, that's a national security issue. And there are other industries which are national security issues. And I think we need to have a broader national conversation about, do we need a strategy to sort of produce some of that stuff here at home?
Well, I really don't believe that the produce here at home is the right answer. I think we need to have a trust group of allies with whom we do business. Period. End of story. I reject wholeheartedly the notion that I think some in the White House, Peter Navarro, I'm talking to you, some in the White House believe is an opportunity for protectionism. We know where the 1930s went with that. We do not need a new Smoot-Hawley. We do not need indiscriminate use of tariffs. What we need is an intelligent bit of discrimination between good guys and bad guys in key sectors. And that's the challenge. But let's get back to the coronavirus for a second, because I think as we talk about our own deficiencies, as we talk about, the president's terrible speech, as we talk about the CDC and its failings, we have forgotten that if China had not lied and concealed from the very beginning of December, folks, we're 4 months later, right? If they hadn't done that, we wouldn't be in this spot right now. We are here because of the nature of the Chinese Communist Party.
Yes, but that is why we need to start talking about the broader dependence on China for trade. We've already talked about the fact, we've had a terrific episode on this about how totalitarian regimes lie. You've got a great piece in the Dispatch on that, which I recommend that everybody go to, and we'll link to it in the transcript. That is well-trod ground on this podcast. What we need to discuss is, what do we do about it?
Right, why are we incapable?
Do we want to be dependent on a bunch of totalitarian lying dictators? I'm not arguing for protectionism.
Right.
I'm not saying everything has to be produced in America, but would we prefer that some of these products be coming from a more diverse...
From Canada, from France, from
Mexico,
Germany?
Even friendly dictatorships like Vietnam, which is one of the most pro-American countries right now, ironically, in Asia right now, because they're terrified of China too. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. There's lots of places we can be getting this, and also diversifying. Everybody went into China because it was so cheap for so long.
And it's not cheap anymore.
It's not cheap anymore. They've got this myth of 1 billion consumers, that we're going to be able to sell everything. And instead what the Chinese are doing is stealing all their intellectual property and all the rest. We need to really have a reassessment of our trading relationship with China, our economic dependence on China, and whether we need to decouple and diversify.
So Mark and I, of course, never hesitate to put ourselves out there as experts on absolutely everything. But we have our colleague Derek Scissors, who's a resident scholar here at the American Enterprise Institute. He specializes in the Chinese economy. He's the person who I go to anytime I have a question about these issues. And he has been making very, very succinct and crisp arguments for quite a long time, well before the coronavirus, about the need to actually reassess our relationships.
Sometimes the world comes and validates the work you've been doing for 20 years.
He's got a doctorate from Stanford and a master's from Chicago. Derek is the author of AEI's China Global Investment Tracker, which is the only data set out there of Chinese foreign investment. Really gives you a good sense of what the Chinese are up to in the world. So it's really great that on the eve of our shutting down here at AEI, we were able to grab him in this studio.
Derek, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
It's great to have you here. So there's so many businesses shutting down. There's schools shutting down, airlines shutting down. AEI is shutting down. This is going to have a huge economic impact. You're an economist. You're an expert on China, with whom our economy is inextricably linked right now. Tell us, are we going to have a coronavirus recession?
I think we probably are, and I'm going to say that disagreeing with Michael Strain yesterday.
Michael Strain's our Director of Economic Studies.
Michael may have changed his mind given the extent of shutdowns across the country just between yesterday and today. But I'll say that let's remember what a recession is. We're at very low levels of unemployment. A recession is 2 consecutive quarters of less economic activity. And so unemployment rises, but it's rising from a really low level. This isn't a recession where people our age think of the 1970s or people thinking of the global financial crisis when unemployment jumps to 11%. This is a technical recession. And the reason is all these things you just mentioned shutting down, that's what GDP is. It's a measure of economic activity. We're just buying less stuff because we're staying home.
I don't know. I'm buying more stuff at home.
All right. Well, right. shopping
Danny's
sites.
just hanging out and shopping at home instead of doing this podcast. There you go.
Okay.
Danny is not
there's
leading
select-
economic
there's
indicator.
there's select purchases, but like travel, tourism, sporting events, all the spending is going to go down. So that's fine. Activity can come back really, really
But that's not a structural issue. That's a
Right.
temporary issue based
Exactly.
on people
People's
self-quarantining.
choices,
essentially.
right.
Right.
Yes.
Right.
And
Which
as
will come
long-
bounding back.
Exactly. There will be a V-shaped recovery because American people are just as productive as they were before. There's anywhere that there's been, I don't mean to put this crudely, mass death. In the worst cases, that's not the case. We're going to have the same
Fewer people will die
Right.
probably of the coronavirus than actually will die of the flu worldwide this year. Still.
Right. And we need to take steps to make sure that's true, which is why we're doing all this shutdown. And then the capital stock is affected by Wall Street, but the actual physical capital, that's just a valuation of the capital. That we haven't destroyed any buildings. This isn't a war. It isn't an earthquake. It isn't anything like that. So I think technically we're going to have a recession because there's going to be less activity. I don't think in a year the U.S. economy is going to be harmed by this because we'll become soaring back. The people at risk are people who, as we've been discussing, and businesses that live paycheck to paycheck. And that's who Congress and the administration should be helping. Because if we can help them, the people who have several months of savings, they're going to be fine. So I think technically we're going to have a recession. I think for the economy as a whole, it doesn't matter very much given where we started. But I think there are people who are at economic risk that we need to help right now.
So let's talk a little bit about China. So, and again, we've covered with Scott Gottlieb and others some of the medical questions relating to China's management, as well as a lot of the political questions. And that's really where the political economic stuff comes in. So I don't think people in America have talked about supply chains this much in the history of the world. But what we suddenly realize is the Diet Coke we're drinking right now, we're getting sweeteners from China, shoes, pharmaceuticals, automobile parts. We can go down the list. How much of a disruption to the global supply chain is there going to be? And add to that as well, is the Chinese economy also going to slow down dramatically and drag others down with it?
Second question first. China's economy absolutely will slow down dramatically. It won't be reported, but the Chinese...
Because they lie.
Right. The Chinese are even saying now that 60% of their small firms have gone back into operation. Not at full capacity. They've just gone back into some sort of operation. They previously claimed, it was a lie, that small firms account for huge amounts of their economy. Now they'll discover that isn't true, of course. But China is going to have a crash in the first quarter, is having a crash in the first quarter. That's worse than anything that's going to happen to us.
Why is it worse?
Because their health solution was to paralyze everything very early on. So they gave out orders that it's hard for us to give out. We have to think about the people, and they enforced them by force. Wuhan quarantine wasn't like voluntary. You just don't leave, stay home. It'll be fine.
I was at a church a couple of weeks ago where there was a priest who came back from China, who's a Chinese priest who had been there, and he showed pictures to the congregation of literally signs outside a building that said, "Don't leave this building or we will break your legs." That's literally what the sign said.
So, all the terrible things you can imagine happening in a crisis that threatens the communist regime in China have happened. And those froze economic activity much worse. And the other thing for Americans to realize, we're still a much more advanced nation than China. China is not Shanghai. When we talk about telework, 90% of Chinese don't have that kind of option. Yeah, okay, in the cities, in the rich cities they do, but most Chinese don't. So when they're told to go home, that's the end. They're stuck at home, and that's the end of their economic contribution. So it's going to be worse in China in the first quarter. What the Chinese have bought with these, we'll break your legs if you leave this building kind of reactions, is they're bringing their supply back up. They're already into the V-shaped recovery. February was awful, right? I mean, really a depression level month. But March is clearly better than February. April will be clearly better than March. So the question on the U.S. side question for the world is, if you're supplying China with energy, you're kind of out of luck. Chinese energy demand is going to drop and you're stuck. And so there are a bunch of commodity suppliers who supply China, and they're going to take a big hit. And the oil fight for the Saudis and the Russians is going to make everything worse for oil suppliers. For the U.S., what we're looking at is about a 2-month disruption, and disruption sounds so vague. It's 2 months that, depending on the industry you're in, you get nothing from China. So pharmaceuticals is what everybody's worried about because the Chinese stopped sending stuff to the Indians, period. And the Indians then said, well, we're not exporting because we're not getting anything from China. We're hoarding, which we have not felt yet. There's going to be about a 2-month blip where pharmaceutical products are not in new supply. That doesn't mean we'll run out. That depends on the stockpile. It depends on the demand. Maybe people, aren't going to get headaches as much, and they're going to be worried about respiratory ailments. So we're going to have a 2-month hit, which we have not felt yet. I'm not enough of an expert on everything in the U.S. supply chain to know where it's going to be hurt the most, but I think that is going to affect us next month. We're going to start seeing the effect of China's decline next month. It will last into May. Then it will, because of these stark Chinese measures, it will ease.
So I'm just reading from some research that we put together, but Chinese pharmaceutical companies supply more than 90% of U.S. antibiotics, vitamin C, which, by the way, doesn't help you, ibuprofen, hydrocortisone, and acetaminophen, that's Tylenol for those of you guys who don't pay attention, and 40 to 45% of heparin, which is a blood thinner, which
is really
used
important
very important to a lot of people. Right. So, I mean, it represented 20% of overall U.S. imports in 2018. Does that have an impact on our economy?
Well, I don't think it has an impact on our economy. The numbers here are not, that's an impressive, scary list of drugs. The numbers aren't that big. I mean, it's not that big in industry. Like when people are concerned about rare earths, our rare earth imports from China, well, we only import them from China, but the numbers are tiny.
Right.
So the question would be shortages of those drugs. I'm pretty skeptical on some of the sourcing on what Chinese actual contribution is. There's a supply chain. This sounds weird, but there's a supply chain in little tiny pills like there is in your computer monitor. And little tiny pills get assembled in different places. So people are backtracking the supply chain. And since the supply chain runs through India, all their numbers are wrong because the Indians have no idea what's actually going on.
Which gives us great confidence in our drugs.
No, that's
that's a whole other
so that's the risk.
Yeah.
I don't believe those 90% numbers, but if somebody said pick a number, I'd say 60%. How confident are you in that? Not confident. So we're going to find out that our dependence on China in some drugs is lower than we think, but in others it's not. And we don't know yet which it is because we don't know where substitutes can ramp up quickly and so on. There are going to be stockpile shortages of some drugs for sure. Whether they get to the market depends on how much stockpiling people have done. The one advantage here, if our companies are competent, is they've had 2 months warning. We'll see.
Yeah.
We'll see.
Yeah. I mean, but it's not just that. It's like there's apparently 90% of our generic drugs come from India and China, right? So you're talking about antidepressants, HIV/AIDS medications, birth control, chemotherapy, Alzheimer treatments, diabetes, epilepsy, Parkinson's, ADHD medicines for kids. And under our system, for the most part, people only get like a 30-day supply. You can't really stockpile medicines because the insurance companies mostly require you to get 30 days and then renew. So are we going to have
individuals can't, right?
Yeah, individuals. So but my point being, are we going to have like a rush on the pharmacies soon where people are fighting over, over their medicines?
Thanks, Mark. Look, there could be a situation where people are panicking over toilet paper, which is not really related to a respiratory illness. There could be a situation where people decide to panic. There's nothing to be done about that. Again, there's been lead time. There should be warnings privately to the U.S. government about sourcing. The military, for example, has stockpiles of drugs they can make available. Eventually, publicly, companies are going to have to say this is for stock purposes. This is where we're at. It is a threat. I hope. It's very difficult to say which drug is going to be in short supply and which is not. I don't have that level of knowledge. I'm not sure a pharmaceutical expert has that level of knowledge, again, because of the opacity, the lack of knowledge that we have of the China and India supply chain. I hope this is a warning, and the warning is obvious, which is this is ridiculous.
Diversification is what we need to do.
Right. If somebody says, hey, we got 4 different kinds of painkillers, we can rely on one of them, for the supply chain, I'm fine. But if you have a critical drug, we mentioned heparin, we mentioned anti-HIV prophylactics. If you have a critical drug, you cannot be running it through China and India. And to their credit, a couple of Democratic lawmakers brought this up 8 months ago. And we should have brought it up 8 years ago. So I hope that this is a warning And we can get to the bigger issue of decoupling from China, but having drugs that American people rely on come through China and India, that's a situation we have to address in some way.
So it's not just drugs. It's a lot of things that we're very dependent on China. Donald Trump has been warning that we're too dependent on China. He said the other day, the coronavirus shows the importance of bringing all that manufacturing back to America, and we will have that started. We obviously can't bring all manufacturing back to America, but it does raise the question, are there certain areas and industries and things where we really do need a domestic manufacturing base so that we're not dependent on a country like China that we can't rely on?
President Trump often sounds to me exactly right about trade, and then he can't stick with it. So, yes, there are absolutely...
That's a different question.
Right.
Right.
Well, I mean, which Trump are we talking about? The Trump that says there are essential industries that we should not be dependent on the Chinese for? I agree completely. I've been making that argument for years, and you can look back, The Trump that says Canadian steel is a threat to our national security and that's where I'm going to start my trade action? No. The Trump that treats China as if it's the same as our treaty allies whom we're sworn to go to war with? Again, no. Who are democracies, who tell the truth about what's going on in their countries? Again, no. So if you start off with there are critical industries we should have in North America or among our friends and not in China, that's 100% true. That's not the way U.S. policy has gone. If U.S. policy had gone that way, we would have evaluated what really matters, like pharmaceuticals, at the beginning of the Trump administration, or even better, the Obama administration, and taken action on that. The president has really been focused on big numbers in the trade deficit, which is a different thing. I'm not talking about reducing the trade deficit. We shouldn't be talking about reducing the trade deficit. We should be talking about what are industries that we don't want to depend on the Chinese for, even if the numbers are small. And consumer electronics are still these giant imports from China because who cares?
So here's the question. One of the cases that you've been making over the years is just this, that the United States is too dependent, that fundamentally it's not that we shouldn't be trading with China. It is that China's a risk, China's a liability, China's a threat. Okay, and that we can't really extricate one problem from the other. You can't have trade with good China and confront bad China in the South China Sea. That's not how they look at it. That's not how we should look at it. And you've actually argued for a disengagement. Is this crisis an opportunity for us to accelerate that disengagement?
It should be.
And then how do we do it?
Right. We've seen, this is the most high-profile, scary virus that's come out of China. It's not the first. It won't be the last. We have lots of evidence about this. Mostly it affects animals, so it's in a sense good for our farmers. But the same process, so they have these plagues spreading through their animal population, lends itself to things like the COVID outbreak. So we should take this opportunity to think, all right, if the Chinese cut themselves off because they had a virus, or they cut us off because they're angry at us because we won't let them invade Taiwan, or whatever their motivation is. What do we not care about? We don't care about cheaper computers. That's fine. Make them in China. Knock yourselves out, guys. We do care about drugs. We do care about things, that matter to the health and safety of the American people.
Diet Coke.
That's true. If the Diet Coke is poisoned, a lot of people are in trouble, including the two people sitting across from me here. That's the kind of discussion we should have right now. It's the whole thing of we should treat no changes in our relationship with China because American companies make too much money, or abandon the Chinese completely. That's not the real choice. The real choice is we should use this opportunity to say what industries actually matter to America. It's not steel. It's not cars. I'm sorry, Mr. President, that's wrong. It might be semiconductors. It certainly should be products that Americans need for their health. And we're going to have to decide then, okay, not China, a tougher choice because it's a democracy, but not a reliable trade partner would be India. Reliable choices are the Canadians, the Germans. These are democracies that we have alliances with. So we don't need to bring everything back to the United States, and we don't need to be taking everything out of China. We have to start the process of making those calls, which this administration hasn't done, even though it's correctly raised the alarm on China when the Obama administration did not at all.
Right. So how do we, the fear that I have is exactly the one that you articulated, the which Donald Trump problem, which is that this is an opportunity not for protectionism, not for, a designation of national strategic industries a la French style, which is also protectionism. This is an opportunity to basically whitelist a group of our trading partners and blacklist the others. And by the way, isn't the fight over Huawei and ZTE, isn't that wouldn't it have a similar effect on that kind of thing as well, where you basically choose and that you build a group of countries, as we did during the Cold War, that trade with each other and don't trade with bad guys?
I think in some industries that's what we need to do. And we've been focused, you're absolutely right, we've been focused on technology, and now we're reminded that healthcare is really important. And, even though we don't think of healthcare in connection with our military the way we think of communications, in a crisis, we do need to think of that. So absolutely the first step should be treating our friends much better than we treat everyone else. And, we can argue over who's our friend. I'd go for a broad definition. Until somebody proves otherwise, I'd say innocent until proven guilty. But absolutely, that's why it's so upsetting to me that the president was acting as if European cars were the biggest trade issue outside of China. They're completely different. Stop talking about that. It would be great right now if the president said, look, I'm not changing my views of trade, but we're not going to put tariffs on European cars in the situation that we're in the United States and Europe. That's just not going to help at all. That would be useful to the stock market. It would be useful to people's long-term expectations. And then on the other side, with regard to, I wouldn't, we don't want to say blacklist necessarily because that would be for everything. I would have the group of countries where we say, look, you can provide us with a lot of stuff, and we're happy that your workers can get good salaries and you can make money, and that's all good. Trade is mutually beneficial, but not for things that we think are important. So unfortunately,
so what are those things?
Well,
healthcare is one of them. What is
Danny didn't want to do this for good reason, because once you open the door, this is the big scary thing about protectionism. Once you open the door and says my industry is crucial for national security, everybody's like, hey, look, there's a line of 150 people, like Costco toilet paper lines, trying to get into my industry is crucial for national security.
No, but Derek points it out.
So,
the steel industry wants it. The airline industry wants it because China's trying to compete there. Right. And an F-35 is not the same as a Boeing commercial jet.
I mean, there's a overwhelming bipartisan view in Congress that we need to change our relationship with China in particular. And bill after bill is introduced, and leadership won't let them pass because they'll embarrass the president because he's very focused on his Phase 1 deal. If we wanted to take this opportunity, we can forge a bipartisan consensus on not stuff we need to subsidize, not stuff we need to cut off Mexico on or any stuff we don't want to get from China because there's a consensus on China. And so the way I want to build a wall between protectionism, which is all of our industries need help because I'm important, I'm so-and-so, and what we need to do to disengage partly from the Chinese is to say it's not about the industry, it's what we don't want China to supply us with. And my answer to that is we don't want to be in a technologically dependent relationship with the Chinese, which a lot of our tech firms are now, where they claim, I can't make money unless I can sell to the Chinese. All right, that's no good because the Chinese will squeeze you. And now we have a very strong reason for health and safety. So I would look for advanced technology and health and then have the bipartisan discussion where we've shown that we can act on China.
So one of the things, when I talked about the Cold War, I was talking about COCOM. So the COCOM, it was so long ago, I can't even remember what it stood for. But that was a multilateral arrangement in which we agreed that we were not going to buy certain things from the Soviet bloc and that we were not going to sell certain things to the Soviet bloc. It was followed by something called the Wassenaar Arrangement. And it was mostly us and our NATO allies, right? That's the thing, to my mind, that might need to proceed. So this is my question, cart-horse question, right? Should we be leading on this? Should we have congressional action that starts this disengagement on these key issues? Or should we try to actually put together a new COCOM with our European, our Canadian, our Commonwealth, friends?
We have to lead. And the reason is, and I deal with the Europeans all the time, they don't see China as a security threat.
Right.
They see China as a health threat now. They see China as an economic threat. But, they're not in Asia. They're like, oh, yeah, I understand your concerns. I don't care.
Because during the Cold War, they had all the missiles pointed at them.
Right.
Now they've got Chinese tourists.
So,
exactly.
So we need to lead. And I'm not saying that us leading magically solves all the problems, but we're not leading. And I'll give you a very concrete example. Congress in July 2018 overwhelmingly passed changes to both our foreign investment regime, which is known as the body is known as CFIUS, Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, and our export control regime. Overwhelming bipartisan basis. We have not done anything on export controls. Treasury has put out its implementing regulations for CFIUS. I don't think they were that good, but they did their job.
Right.
And Commerce has done nothing on export controls. So when we go to the UK about Huawei and we say, you need to take this costly action to keep Huawei out of your network. So I'm sorry, your Department of Commerce is not even implementing export controls passed on an overwhelming bipartisan basis by your own Congress because industry doesn't like it. So we don't have our own house in order to be having these discussions. All it would turn into is a bunch of finger pointing where we say to the Europeans, you don't take China seriously as a security threat. And they point back at us and say, you don't take China seriously as an economic threat. Yeah. So we have to get our own house in order first and then go to our allies. Japan and Australia, thankfully, will be with us. They are in East Asia. But if we don't have a consistent set of actions on our part, we can't talk with other people productively.
This is the fundamental problem, though, is that in the Cold War, Bernie Sanders accepted, we understood that everyone understood the Soviet Union was the enemy, right? Today, there's not that kind of consensus. Even in the United States, I don't think that China is our emerging enemy, that this is a country that is the new Soviet Union of the 21st century that's going to threaten us. It's the biggest national security threat. It's starting to happen.
I don't think you feel that way either, though, do you?
I don't think China's look, here's the big difference. Let's say Xi Jinping is as bad as any Soviet party head and dictator. I'm fine with that. I think that's true. China is not the same as the Soviet Union. And so we can't forge the same kind of consensus. For one thing, we had a block in Western Europe of democracies. In East Asia and South Asia, we have a hodgepodge of, who knows what we think about democracy versus dictatorship. So we're not in the same situation. I think the step we can take, and getting back to Danny's point of this crisis and how scary it is, assuming it doesn't go as badly as we fear, is also an opportunity, is to say to the American people, Congress already thinks China is a threat. This virus came from China. Don't forget the freaking propaganda about they did it on purpose or whatever. It came from
everyone running around saying you can't call it the Wuhan virus because that's racist.
It came from China, and are you comfortable with this happening again 10 years from now? Because there's a pretty good chance it'll happen again 10 years from now. Or would you like the government to protect your health and safety by saying this is an unreliable partner? It's reliable for a lot of things that we can continue to have a trade with, and it's unreliable for other things. So I agree I don't think China's the Soviet Union. I think we're already ready to treat China differently than we have been in the Congress, and I think this event is going to bring support in the American people to that same side. And I'll say one thing. Joe Biden's record in the Obama administration was very pro-China as far as I'm concerned. I think it'll be very interesting to watch him try to campaign. I think he's going to sound very different than he did, for example, in 2015, and that is going to reflect shifting American mood where we can take actions against China that before people were wondering, do we really have to do that?
Luckily, Joe Biden doesn't really remember what he did in the Obama administration, so that won't affect him. So I've got a big exit question for you. We talked, just before we started recording the podcast, we talked about this happening again. You just said that again. So one of the conceits that's going to come out of China is we've learned so much. This is never going to happen again. And so don't worry, people. And anyway, it was your fault, America, disinformation. Make a persuasive case why this is going to happen again. Because I think that, we're such a 24-hour news cycle country. Once the stock market starts going up, we're going to forget this happened and start talking about Joe Biden and Donald Trump and Melania and Jill. And that's the way we are, which is a great thing about our country. But we need to be reminded China is going to do this again. What's the persuasive case? Let's say there was no COVID virus at all, and nobody's paying any more attention to China than they did. The Chinese pig population is being ravaged by yet another virus. Now, you might be like, the pig population, who cares? Pork is a staple in China. It's the meat core of their diet. It's responsible for most Chinese inflation bursts. China's inflation is very low, and then pork inflation shoots up and everybody gets upset. They haven't been able to protect their pig population, despite its importance in Chinese food and the happiness of their people, for years and years and years. I have no idea about epidemiology. I do know that when you have animal viruses again and again and again, the chance of one of them jumping, bird flu, pig flu, swine flu, all that, rises. The Chinese have a lot of control over a lot of things in their country, but if they can't control their pigs and they have to become more dependent on us, for example, for pork supply, they don't want to depend on us for food, for Pete's sake. That's a sign to me they don't have it together. So forget COVID. Just ignore all of it. You could still look at what's going on in China in terms of their ability to feed themselves, which is a huge priority for the Communist Party, and say, you can't do it. And if you can't do that, then 10 years from now, animal virus number 38
is going to jump to people again. You're going to lie about it again because you are the Communist Party, and the world is going to be exposed again, even if you take very dramatic, effective actions after the virus jumps and after you lie about it. So we have decades of evidence saying the risk in China is higher than any other country, despite Communist Party control, and then because of Communist Party control.
Terrific. Scary as hell. Geez, thank you so much, Derek. You're
Thank you,
terrific
Derek.
as always.
Really appreciate it.
Glad to be here.
I'm really glad we grabbed Derek before the AEI shut down here and dragged him into the studio before we lose our space here, because I think that was really informative. I want to argue with you about this protectionism point, because every time somebody wants to put some restrictions on trade, everyone sets their hair on fire, says protectionism. I think we need to have a fundamental reassessment of certain things that have been established truths on the right, that all free trade is good, that populism is bad. We just had an election with Donald Trump in 2016 where millions of Americans who weren't getting listened to, whose jobs were being exported to China, and that's true, that's what happened. And on the right, we always say free trade deals, there's no net job loss, right? No, there is a net job loss in Ohio. There's a net job loss in Michigan. And those voters stood up and said, what about us? No one's watching out for us. At the same time, we're discovering now that through globalization, we become completely economically dependent on China in key sectors that we shouldn't be dependent on them for. And so we need to get rid of these turning protectionism into an epithet. We don't want to be protectionist. We don't want Smoot-Hawley. We don't want to go back to what caused the Depression. But we need to have a national discussion about the limits of globalization, the limits of free trade, and have a more balanced policy that takes into concern, number one, our national security, and two, the economic security of a lot of Americans who are getting hurt by unfettered free trade.
Okay. I'm not an absolutist on trade either, and I understand what you're saying, and I think that there's an argument there. The problem is that the rational argument that you're making is an open door for everybody who wants to bring back, to make GM great again. This is the buggy whip industry. At the end of the day, I'm sorry, at the end of the day, what has kept America at the forefront of the global economy has been innovation and productivity. The notion that somehow we should wrest back the making of TVs or your computer screens and give those jobs to people in Ohio or in Michigan is ridiculous. We need to figure this out. Now, so my argument is sort of I half agree with you, which is that I think that there needs to be a recognition that there are some strategic areas.
No, I think you wholly agree with me because I want a balanced approach. And what you're saying is that you're opening the door to the crazies who will say, let's go back to protectionism and inflationism.
But I think a lot of those people who voted for Donald Trump actually do think that they should be making their TVs back. They think we should remember those crappy RCA TVs that we used to have back in the olden days? Right. They think we should be making those again. This is the challenge for us. And I will say this, America is not very good at calibrating. And I don't want us to get off topic. I don't want us to get off topic because I think we need to separate this discussion, which is a much bigger discussion, from the notion that we need to do a reassessment of our relationship with China. As Derek said, that not only do we need to do a reassessment of our relationship, our economic dependence on China, our lack of diversification, but that we need to get our own house in order. Because what we've seen with this Huawei fight is that we cannot get the Europeans to do what we want because they look at us and say, I'm sorry, what? Didn't you just give a waiver to Microsoft to continue working with Huawei?
We don't have an alternative.
Right.
Because we don't have a domestic 5G capability to offer them.
Right.
This
So
is
we're not
making my
even
point.
competing.
Yeah.
So we're not even competing. Right. But our lack of a domestic 5G competitor, I'm not sure we can root it back to this, but I also want to come back to the coronavirus challenge, because Derek said something at the end that I think everybody needs to listen to. And this is the point that you made. Thank you for flagging my piece in the intro. But this is the point that I made in this piece I wrote in the Dispatch. Everybody says, "Oh, America, you can't export democracy, and who cares if they have a totalitarian regime in these places?" And the answer is, you know what? If you're going to do this again, if you want to get coronavirus, Mark III, if you want to get swine flu, HIV, Ebola, if you want to get those diseases again, then we should keep doing things the way we're doing them right now, because these governments, bad governance is what leads to the spread of these diseases. It's Russia that says they have 28 cases. I mean, really? 28 cases? It's the Chinese who have continued to lie about this. It's the Iranians. I don't know whether you guys caught this, but you can see Iranian mass graves from space. I mean, it's mind-boggling because the Iranian government is lying. It's not just the licking of the shrines that they've been recommending. They've been lying about this left, right, and center. Half their cabinet is infected. These are bad people.
There's an upside to every tragedy.
Mark, these are bad people, and they're making Americans sick. We can say we don't give a damn if they die, and that has been the attitude about diseases overseas. But we do give a damn if we die.
Yeah, everybody's walked away from the freedom agenda because, what difference is how does it affect my life if the Chinese are jailing 1 million Uyghurs? Well, this is how it affects your life, because we learned on 9/11 that events happen 3,000 miles away can come to hit us here at home, and it's not just terrorists. It's disease. It's all sorts of things. So we need to have a freedom agenda, and we need to make democracy more of a priority in our foreign policy. But two, we also need to have a real rethink about our trading policies and find that balance and not be terrified by the protectionists to say that we may need to rethink globalization a little bit. We need to have an intelligent policy when it comes to restricting trade with certain countries on certain products that are
relating to national
security, and all the rest of it, and try and favor trading partners and allies who we can count on and trust. And I think that's a reasonable discussion for us to have.
Yes, it is. And you see, the coronavirus has really brought us together, Mark, because we're ending on a note of harmony and consonance. How lovely for us. Thank you guys for listening. See you soon.
Bye.
And our team here at AEI is Alexa Santry, Matt Weinset, Jen Moretta, and Macy Heath.
Let us know what topics you'd like us to cover. You can get in touch with the show by emailing us at whatthehell@aei.org.
Or you can reach us on Twitter. I'm at @dpletka.
And I'm at Mark Thiessen. That's Mark with a C.
Please rate and review the podcast. If you like the show, please subscribe, share it, comment on Apple Podcasts, or wherever you're listening to this.
Thanks for listening.